So on in drag, what I'll do is I will set this.transform.position. We want to set it back to be where it was when we started the drag. So when we end the drag, if we're not dropping it on a slot, make sure we just set it back to where it was. So the position of this object will be equal to, and we're going to do original apparent dot transform dot position. That'll work just fine. So if I click play now, if I drag and I drop it, ooh, what happened there? See, I'm moving really fast, and the begin drag event's not firing right when I start dragging, so you can really get off there. But either way, it is snapping back to its original position, which is good. But keep in mind, we only want that to happen if we're not dropping it on a slot like that. So that should go to that slot. There's no logic for that to happen yet, but that should happen. So what I'll do to make that happen is we'll create a script, like we mentioned in the layout to begin with, called slot. Now, if you have a big game, you might want to make these a bit more specific. So like slot would be item slot or inventory slot or something like that. But slot for me will work. So I'm going to drop this onto a prefab. Just going to drag that out real quick and drop this onto the slot prefab and apply that and delete that. And there we go. So now slot has the slot script on it. Let's open this up. Before we do that though, actually we did not set, one of the requirements that we wrote down was we need to know which slot this item is in so that when we drop it on something, we can reset that slot. To do that, I would do a public integer, and I would call this like slot or slot location, or that makes sense, doesn't it? So just do slot, and that'll be the, or slot ID, I don't know, just slot will work. Now when we add an item, what I want to do, if I go back here where we add items, this is, we're going to be calling this component twice, so you might want to cache it in a variable, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. So I'm going to do item object dot get component. I'm going to grab the item data. I'm going to get the slot and set it be equal to I, because I is the inventory slot that we're adding it to. Look, oh, there's nothing there, so this slot is empty. We add it there, and we also have to make sure we update that that integer whenever we drag an item to a new slot, so that it knows which slot it's in. Now it's updated; it's a different slot. Make sure we tell it that. So now this knows which slot it is in. Cool. Now we have individual slots. Each slot now has a script attached, so each slot now has a slot object on it. What this would need is it also needs the event systems interface, or the namespace. So I'm going to do Unity Engine dot event systems, and this needs a different interface. This event is going to be the onDrop event. The interface we're going to be implementing will be IDropHandler. There you go. Get the red squiggly again. I'm going to quick action that and say add it for me real quick. And notice this has pointer event data and event data. Cool. If you look in here, shares the same types. What's cool about the onDrop event is the pointer event data will contain the item that is being dropped. So it knows what item is being dragged. It's a game object, so we have to dig a bit deeper to get the item, but it knows which game object is being dragged. So we can use that information to bring out the item from that. We can set up item data to be equal to, or it'd be item or dropped item is equal to event data dot, let's see, is it pointer drag? I believe that's the game object. Yeah, there it is, pointer drag. That'll give us the game object that is being dragged. We can do a get component on that and grab the item data component. And there we go. Now we have the item data information, which, as we know, contains the item information, the amount of the item, the slot it's in, and all kinds of good stuff. So it contains all that information. We now have that on the new slot that we dropped it on. So we can use that to detect if we should add it to the slot or what we should do with it. So now I have to check to see if the slot that we're dropping it on contains an item or not. So if it does, we'll just swap them out. If it doesn't, we'll just add the item to that slot. For that, we need access to the inventory object. So I'm going to set up a private inventory, and I'm going to call this inv. And we're going to have a start method. And I'm going to set inventory to be equal to GameObject dot find it by name. You could probably add a tag and make it a bit more efficient, but I'll do it like this for now. Grab the component, and it is called inventory, just like that. So we now have access to the inventory object. Cool. Now what I want to do is I want to do a conditional check here. We're going to check to see if inventory.items I'm not looping through, am I? So what I want to do then is I need to know which slot this slot represents. So that means knowing, like, if we have 20 slots, then we have slots 0 through 20. This slot needs to know which slot it's in so we can compare it to the slot that represents our inventory, so we can compare it to our items list. So 0 through 20 in the items list is the exact same as 0 through 20 in the slots objects here. So what I would do is I could set up a let's make this a public int, and I could call it slot. No, I don't like that, slot. Just ID will work. So ID, so we could say inventory. So we know this, say this is slot 7. We'll compare it to the 7th slot in the actual inventory items to see if there is an item there. So we can say, and the way we'll set this up, the way we'll set ID is to add it whenever we add the slot. We'll do that in a second. So inventory.items ID dot, ooh, it's gonna be confusing now. So ID.ID, but it's saying the items ID, so item 7 dot ID is equal to -1, right? So if it's equal to -1, we know there's no item there. So what we'll do is we'll just set this slot to be equal to that item very easily, hopefully. So I'll say dropped item dot transform dot set parent. We'll set the parent of the dropped item from the, right now it's the slot panel, but if it's in a slot, it has to be that slot as its parent. So to do that, I'll say this dot transform. That'll set this slot's object transform to be equal to the parent of dragged item. And now we have to set the position as well. So what I would do is say dropped item dot transform dot position is equal to this dot transform dot position. So this dot transform dot position is, it represents the slot's position, which is good for us because that will do exactly what we want. So let's check to see what happens now. Click play. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it from there, everything's still fine, and drop it there. And that did not do anything. ID is not being set. I just said we'll do that in a second, and we did not do it in a second. So ID has to be set because we're accessing the ID for the items list. We need to know what item we're checking. So we have to know what ID of the slot is. And to do that, we'll go to inventory. And when we add a slot, what we'll do is we'll just set the ID. Pretty simple. Slots I.get component, and it will be slot, I believe, yeah, slot. .id is equal to I, because I is the current slot we are looped over, and that will set that slot to be equal to 0 through 20, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. If I click play now, we should be able to drag an item from one slot and drop it into another slot. I know this is a crazy amount of work to get this to work, but, oh, it's still not working. I think I know what's going on here. So the way the UI works is it works how you would expect to drag an item in the game world. You would send out a raycast from the mouse and it would see if it intersects anything. I think what's happening is when I drag, let's see here if I can break it. If I were to drag real quick, okay, so I've moved the icon off the mouse. So what that will do for me now is I should not be blocked by that. So if I drop it there, it does fire an event, because before when I do this, Notice how it doesn't do anything? That's because the icon is under my mouse. The raycast is hitting the icon and not going past that. So if I drag a little faster, I get my mouse off the icon. We'll see if it moves faster than that. Drop it there, and it actually fires the event. So what I have to do is whenever I'm dragging, hit the mic. Whenever I'm dragging, I have to deactivate the raycast block for the item that I'm dragging. And to do that, it's kind of simple. I'll go to item and I will go to add component, and I will add something called a canvas group. And this allows us to affect things on this item related to the canvas. So what I can do is say I see blocks raycasts, it is checked. It is always checked when it's interactable unless we turn it off. So what I can do is turn off block raycast while I'm dragging it, and it'll work. So if I turn off block raycast, you'll notice now I can't drag it. That's because it's not getting a raycast at all. There's no information being sent to it because it doesn't get the raycast. But if I turn it on, it'll work just fine. So what I have to do is while I'm dragging, I have to turn off block raycast. So let's do that real quick. I'm going to go back into my slot here. Go to item data. We can do this in on begin drag. What I could do is I can say, this is a component on this object, so I can just do get component off of this object. It's called canvas group. And I can get the block raycasts variable there and set it to false while the drag began. And when the drag ends, we can set it back to true. And that should allow us to fire that event whenever we drop it on a slot. So I'm going to drag it from there, drop it there. The event fired, as it should. So now the issue is, so one way I can check that is I'm saying inventory items id.id is equal to -1. What I can do is I can debug and make sure that this is actually a null item I'm dropping it on. If not, we have an error somewhere else, and it's very likely. So I'm going to do inventory.items id.id. So we're going to log out the ID of the item that we're dropping it on, and if it is not -1, then we screwed up somewhere. Let's get rid of that. If not, it's something else. Drag it from there, drop it there. It is logging -1, so it's just something else. Let's see, when is this firing off? Because this is also setting the parent and the position. So if this is firing off before that, we should be okay. Let's debug this. I'll call this and I'm going to debug this. See if this is even getting called here. Okay. So I click and drag and drop. Alright, so it is getting fired. It is setting its position to be that slot. But then that is firing after that, which means what's happening is on drop is being fired before on and drag, which is saying what this sets this position to be this, but since this that's on drop, right? So that's happening, but then on and drag is being fired, and that's a problem. All right, so the issue is, I had to take a second there to look it over, is on and drag is, as we talked about, is being fired after on drop. So no matter what we do here with the parent and the position, this is going to override it because of how that works. So what I want to do is I want to set the parent to be equal to the slot based on the slot ID that we have here. And then what we can do is when we drop it here, I can set slot to be equal to this slot. That way, if there is a drop event, we will set the slot to be equal to this slot. That way, when this event fires, this will just set it back to be, or this will set it to the new slot, which will be this. So I can explain that here in a second, but what I need for that is I need a couple of things. I need access to the inventory. which we need anyway for different things, but we can do that right there. And I'm going to do this in start. And I'm sure there's 123 different ways to do this, so let me know in the comments below what you would do. But I'm going to do this real quick just to get through this. Do a GameObject.find. I'm going to do inventory, and I'm going to get component on that. And I'm going to do inventory, and I'm going to do that. Now we have inventory, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to say, first of all, we don't need the original parent because we're not going to be using that anymore. I should have done it this way to start with, I guess. So inventory.slots, grab the slot that we're currently on, and say transform. So what it's doing is it's saying, I'm going to go to the slots list in our inventory, which contains a list of game objects that represent slots. Grab the transform of that based on the current slot we're on, so the integer slot. You get it? Makes sense. So we can do it that way, and then set the position to be equal to inventory.slots slot.transform.position, and there you go. So it's going to set the position of this item to be the slot that it is assigned to be. So what we would then do is in here, we wouldn't even have to set the position on this event. But quickly what I want to do is I want to do dropped item dot slot is equal to ID. So it's going to set the slot of the item that we just dragged here to be equal to this slot ID. That way we know if we do drop it on a slot, this event will be fired. The slot ID will be updated to be the ID of the slot it was dropped on. That way when this does its thing, it's going to actually get the new slot, not the old slot, because we didn't change the slot here in this event, we changed it in this event. This gets fired first, but this has no reason to override it. There's nothing to override it with, so that should do what we want. So I hit Control S, and I go into Unity and click play. And if I were to drag and drop from there to there, notice, look at that, it snaps to that slot as it's supposed to. Good stuff, but it doesn't go back to a slot that the slot that it began in, the slot that it started out at. That is because we're not zeroing out that slot at all. We can fix that here in a second, but what I want to do now is I want to see, since this isn't actually doing anything, because what's actually happening is on and drag is getting called every time, so we don't have to set the position here. That's just kind of redundant, right? So what that should do is allow us to still do the same thing, but we just need it to call the position one time when the drag has ended. So there we go. Clean up the code a bit. Works good. So the issue now is it is checking to see if the slot is null. So we know that what we need to do is when we drag an item from a slot, we need to make sure we null out that item or the slot that the item came from. So we need to clear out the items at the original slot location. So to do that, I would do inventory.items. I would grab the the dropped item dot slot, that slot location, set it equal to being a new item. That will null out that item and make there be not an item there. And we're doing that before we reset the slot to this slot. That way we clear out the old slot and make sure we set it now to be equal to this slot. So what that should do is allow us to drag it back. Drag it there and drag it back. No problem. So it is clearing out the slot we drag it from and only assigning it to the new one, which is cool. So the slot that it was is now empty. There's no item there. If we can go to the canvas, we can go to the inventory panel, go to the slot panel, and you can also notice that it is assigning it to the correct parent, just like that, as we drag and drop it around. Looking good. So now what we have to do is, we're doing that, and that's fine, but we also have to set the new slot to be equal to that item in the inventory items. So we're doing this, we're clearing out the old slot. Let's set the new slot to be equal to, so it'd be items ID is equal to dropped item dot item. And that's going to set it to be equal to the new item. Cool. Now we need to handle if we're dragging the item and dropping it onto a slot that contains an item. So we're going to do an else. So if this is not true, that means there is an item there. What we need to do is just swap the item's locations. So the first thing we have to do is we have to grab the item that represents the item in the UI. that is already in that slot so we can move it to the other position. And I'm going to handle that by just grabbing, we can just grab a transform. I want to call it item, just item will work, is equal to, we're going to do this transform, but then we're going to get the child because we know that it's a child of the slot, and it's going to be the first item, the first object as the child, the only object in this case. It's going to grab that, it's going to know that's the item, so now we can take this and move it to where it has to be so we can swap them out physically. So we could handle this the same way as we handled the other one by doing we could update the slot location and then set it to be equal to the slot's position that way, or we could do it by setting it to be equal to the dropped items slot location before we even do all that. So what I'll do is I'll just do item data, or not item data, item.getComponent, item data. It's going to grab the item that's already in the slot, and I'm going to say the slot is equal to the dropped item dot slot. So we're going to say the slot that was here, its slot is now going to be equal to the new slot. This makes me curious as to how we could do this with a setter. If we were to use a setter here, we could set the slot like we're doing here, but then make sure it calls a method that would move the item to the new slot. That'd be a lot cleaner way to handle this, and you might want to look into that, and we might actually change that in the future, but for now, we'll keep going just like this. You need to set this parent, the item that was here, set its parent, do set parent, no, set parent, to be equal to the new slot. So that would be inventory dot slots dropped item dot slot, and get that transform component for that to make it its parent. And now we have to set the position, item.transform.position is equal to the inventory.slots dropped item.slot.transform.position. Again, you might want to set this up into a method in the item data and call it with a setter. That would make a lot more sense. So we're moving the item to the old slot. Now let's move the item we're dropping to this slot. The dropped item slot is equal to the ID of this slot. Dropped item.transform.setParent is equal to this.transform. And dropped item.transform.position is equal to this.transform.position. So there we go. Now that should be working. We also want to make sure we update the stuff behind the scenes though, as we're not doing. We keep forgetting to do that. When I do that, I also want to set, so we're going to set the inventory dot items dropped item dot slot is equal to the, see where it came from, is equal to the item that we're sending to it from this slot. So it's equal to item dot get component item data dot item. There we go. So it's going to set that to be equal to that. And we'll have to set the new slot to be equal to, or the slot we drop this item on to be equal to this item. So inventory dot items, this item slot is equal to dropped item dot item. And this should wrap up our drag and drop pretty good. So if I go here and I'm going to test it, and I'm sure everything's going to break, why not? Drag and drop still works just like that. I'm going to drag this and drop it on that glove. Wow, it worked. Okay, cool. So that's pretty easy to achieve. It wasn't that difficult. There's a few steps to it, yeah, but once you understand what your goal is, what you have to do, it's just writing it out, just making it happen. So that will work for us. Now, you can imagine how this would apply to a lot of other things. Say you have two inventory windows. There's no reason, if you use the same slots, I mean, there's no reason you couldn't just drag this from here and drop it over in that window. It would do the same thing. It has an on-drop event. It would set its slot to be equal to that slot, and it would work out just like that. So there's no reason you should have issues doing that. I've had a lot of suggestions for a crafting system. That would be kind of like a stretch goal kind of thing for this, because this is already a pretty complex system, but when you add something like that into it, it gets a bit more complex. So I would like to do that. I want to hear if you guys would be interested in seeing something like that. So let me know what you guys think. Keep in mind, this series is supported by my Patreon campaign, and we are doing awesome over there, guys. I really appreciate it. If you like this series, you want to get this inventory, all you have to do is support the campaign. $4 or more, you get the inventory, you get support, you get different things depending on the tier you pledge. Thank you guys for watching. I will see you next time.